They say some knocks change your life. But when Silas Boon opened that door, it wasn't just his life that shifted, it was everything he thought he'd buried. The knock came after sundown. Not a timid rap, but a sharp, splintering sound, like someone desperate or mad or both. The kind of knock a man ignores at his own peril. Silas Boon didn't move at first. He sat in his chair by the hearth, boots off pipe, cooling in his palm, watching the fire toss shadows up the log wall. The rain had begun an hour ago, steady and cold, slicing through the wind like sharpened wire. No one had business coming this far out after dark unless trouble rode with them. The second knock was softer but longer. A dragging palm maybe, or a head against the wood that got him up. He reached for the shotgun he kept leaning against the wall, his limp noticeable as he crossed the room. His right leg still gave him hell ever since the canyon fall 2 winters back. Same fall that took his wife. Folks in town said Silas was never the same after that. Less a man, more a ghost with chores. He cracked the door. The woman stood there in the rain like she belonged to it. Her dress soaked and clinging made her look like part of the storm itself. Her face pale, bruised, and bleeding flickered in and out of view as lightning struck behind her. She didn't speak, but her eyes did. Worn and haunted, yet steady. "He ain't yours," she finally said, voice low and shaking but fierce. "But he needs you." In her arms, a baby blinked from the folds of a blanket, round dark eyes too knowing for their size. Silas stared. Something old and hollow in him stirred a ghost ache. Then, "No," he said and shut the door. For a man like Silas, shutting the door on the world came easy. But that night, the rain wasn't the only thing waiting outside. It was the past and maybe something like redemption. He stood against the door, his breath shallow, heart galloping. 10 seconds, then 20. Then the quiet hit him harder than the knock. When he opened the door again, the woman was gone, but the bundle remained. No cry, no movement, just a soaked gray blanket on the porch, like the world had left him a question and dared him to answer it. The note was ruined by rain, the ink bleeding into nothingness, except for one line: "Don't let him grow up like his father." Silas stared, the fire behind him cracked. He hadn't held a baby since not now, not again. But then the baby stirred, made a soft sound. And that was it. That was enough. Silas knelt, wrapped the boy in his flannel, and took him in. Inside, he spoke aloud, though no one listened. "I don't know what the hell I'm doing." The baby didn't answer, just blinked. Silas fed the fire, found an old rag, warmed water, and cleaned the boy's face. It had been years since he cared for anything, even longer since something had needed him. That night, long after the fire dimmed and the wind howled like a warning, Silas sat with the boy resting against his chest. His voice cracked from disuse. "You're just trouble, ain't you? Trouble with a quiet cry and eyes that see too much." But it wasn't fear in Silas's chest. It wasn't pain. It was the first flicker of purpose. And though he didn't know it yet, that baby had already rewritten his story. He didn't cry. That was the part Silas noticed most. Babies cried, didn't they? But this one, it was like someone had already taught him silence. An hour later, Silas stepped out into the morning wind. Baby tucked against his chest in a makeshift sling. Mist clung to the hills. The trail to town was soggy and slow. Mules' hooves sucked at the earth with every plodding step. No one noticed when Silas Boon came riding into town with a baby strapped across his chest. They stared, yes, but not with welcome. A few men tilted their hats. Some didn't bother. At the general store, old Mara narrowed her eyes when she saw the child. "Ain't yours," she said, more question than statement. Silas didn't answer. He gathered supplies, powdered milk, linen, a bottle, candles, shells, potatoes. Mara's look followed him out like a curse tied to his boot. Down the street, Sheriff Danner leaned against his doorframe, thumbing the edge of a wanted poster. A frayed piece of paper with a name that stuck like a splinter, Clay Maddox. The sheriff squinted as Silas passed. "You taken up midwife in Boone?" he asked, dry as the dirt road. "Nope," Silas said. The sheriff's tone sharpened. "Looks like you found someone's mistake." Silas kept walking. "Looks like I found someone's son." That stopped the sheriff for a breath. Then he said nothing more, just watched him leave. Back at the cabin, the wind had shifted. The storm's scent was gone, but something meaner clung to the air, the kind that didn't come from clouds. Silas laid the baby in an old drawer, lined it with wool, and stood over him. There was something about how the boy breathed, so quiet, so deliberate. Like he knew he'd only get one chance in this life to be held by someone who meant it. Silas lit the lantern early. Boiled water. Shaved for the first time in years. The kind of thing a man did when expecting company or ghosts. He sat on the porch, coffee cooling in his hands, waiting. Not for the woman, not even for the storm, but for the weight of whatever came next. He remembered the last time he'd shaved the day of his wife's funeral. She died in silence, same as she'd lived, and now here he was again, with a baby wrapped in fate and grief and someone else's blood. The grave out back remained unmarked. His hands had bled digging it, just like they had holding a dying child once in Wichita, one used as a shield. That memory had a name too, Maddox. Silas whispered into the dark. Your mama ran, I reckon, from something worse than me. Or maybe she meant to die and just didn't. At dawn he found footprints behind the house, small, barefoot, led to the trees, ended at the riverbank. A torn strip of yellow caught in a thorn. She'd come back, he murmured, or never left. When he returned, the baby was staring at the door, as if he too had heard something in the woods. Silas sat beside him on the floor. What kind of woman leaves her child with a man she don't know? But there was no anger in the question, only wonder, only fear. You got your father's name or hers? The baby blinked. A soft coo escaped. Silas leaned back. Guess we'll figure it out, you and me. He didn't know much, only that he couldn't walk away from this, not now. And for a man who'd vowed to die alone, that was saying something. There stood a man in a dust-colored duster hat, low over sharp cheekbones, eyes like burnt coal. You, Silas Boon. The voice had the smoothness of riverstone and none of the warmth. Silas didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the man, boots fine but worn, revolver on one hip, knife on the other. Empty hands but not empty threats. Depends who's asking. Name's Ruckler, the stranger said. I ride for someone. He's got a question you might be able to answer. Silas's voice was gravel. And what's that? You've been seen carrying a baby Boon. Silas's jaw clenched. You ride all this way for gossip. Ruckler didn't blink. You show up in town with a child, don't look a bit like you folks talk. And the man I ride for, he listens. Silas stepped forward slow, steady the porch creaking beneath him. Ain't a crime to care for what someone else left behind. Less what they left belongs to someone dangerous, Ruckler replied. Clay Maddox don't misplace things. The name struck like iron. Maddox, the kind of man whispered about, never spoken of loud. He wasn't a myth. He was worse. Real. Didn't ask for him, Silas replied. She left him on my porch. Don't matter. Clay wants what's his. Silas narrowed his eyes. He beat her near to death. That's what I saw. Ruckler's tone didn't shift. He'll come, and he don't come to talk. Silas didn't reply. He just watched as Ruckler mounted up and rode into the dust. Then he shut the door, bolted it, and stood in silence for a long time. Inside, the baby slept. But peace was an illusion. Silas knew it wouldn't last. He picked up the boy, held him close, and whispered, not a fact but a vow. You ain't his. That night, Silas moved like a man with ghosts behind him. He packed dry food, hid supplies under the floorboards, nailed shut the windows, loaded his shotgun with slow, deliberate calm. He didn't have an army, but he had a cause. Sometimes that was enough. Days passed, too quiet, too still. He fed the baby, let him feel sunlight in the mornings, taught him to breathe without fear, even if fear was all Silas knew. Then the town caught fire. Delivery stable burned. Sheriff Danner met him by the smoldering ruin. 3 horses gone. 1 carried mail. Someone carved a message, the sheriff said. He showed Silas a charred scrap, 5 letters burned into wood. He's not just looking, Danner warned. He's sending a message. And this town, it won't stand behind you. Silas nodded, wasn't expecting it to. Leave, Danner urged. Take the boy. Get lost in the mountains. Maybe, Silas replied, but they both knew he wouldn't. When he returned home, she was waiting. No knock this time, just a shadow on the porch. The woman Maeve sat with the baby in her lap, back to the door. You got some damn timing, Silas muttered. I saw the smoke. Her arms bore new bruises, dark green and angry. He found me in Silverton, said he forgave me, then broke 2 ribs. Silas tightened his hold on the child. Should have stayed gone. I couldn't. His name's Rowan, she whispered. Silas blinked. You just now picked that. No, I just never said it aloud. If he gets me, I don't care. But if he gets Rowan, he won't, Silas promised. You'll need help. He never comes alone. I can hold this ground. You're one man. I've been one man for a long time. She kissed Rowan's head and handed him to Silas. I'll stay if that's all right. Silas nodded. Reckon it's your cabin too, least until the storm passes. The rain returned past midnight, soft at first, like the sky was holding its breath. Inside the cabin, Maeve wrapped Rowan in wool, her hands shaking as she worked. The baby stirred but didn't cry. Silas sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with methodical patience. His jaw was tight, his silence heavier than steel. Maeve watched him from the hearth, and though neither spoke, both knew what was coming. Outside, the wind howled through the ridge. The cabin walls groaned. Something scraped the roof, not leaves, not wind. It was the world warning them. "Do you think he'll come himself?" Maeve asked. Silas didn't look up. "He'll come." "You think he'll kill us?" Silas finally raised his eyes. "I think he already decided to." Maeve kissed Rowan's chest, whispering a prayer not to God, but to her mother, a whisper of guilt and hope tangled in every word. Silas stood, opened the door, and let the rain find his face. The darkness beyond the tree line was alive with movement. Not animals, not wind, men. "They're here," he said. Maeve gripped the pistol. It no longer felt foreign in her hands. The first bullet shattered the lantern. Glass and flames sprayed across the floor. Rowan cried his first real cry, sharp, alive, furious. Silas dove to the window, peeking through the gap. 4 men, maybe 5. Maddox will be behind them. "What do we do?" Maeve asked. "We make them earn every step." The door buckled. Silas fired once. A scream. 1 man down. Another cursed and ducked behind the well. Lightning lit the clearing, throwing jagged shadows. Maeve moved fast, placed Rowan in the crawl space cushioned with blankets. Her hand lingered on the board before pulling it closed. Boots thundered across the porch. A second man kicked the door. It splintered. He charged in. Silas dropped him with a shot. A third man slipped inside, stumbled on blood, scrambled behind the stove. Maeve fired, missed. He raised his gun. Silas tackled him. Gunfire, splinters. A brutal struggle. Silas slammed his rifle stock into the man's jaw. Bone crunched, then silence. Footsteps followed. Slow, measured. Clay Maddox entered the cabin like death dressed in leather. His coat was black, his beard silver-streaked, his eyes cold, muddy green. He looked at Maeve. "That ain't yours." She didn't flinch. "It sure as hell ain't yours either. You ran, I let you. You hid my son. I can't let that go." "He's not your son," she spat. "You're just the man who broke me enough to carry him?" Maddox turned to Silas, bleeding, barely standing. "You don't know what you stepped into." "I know enough. He'll grow up meaner than me no matter who raises him." "You're wrong," Silas said. Maddox raised his gun. Maeve fired first. Her bullet struck his side. He growled, staggered, turned enraged. Silas raised his rifle, but Maddox fired. Silas fell to one knee. Maeve screamed. Rowan cried, loud, sharp, a cry that pierced even Maddox's fury. He hesitated. Silas stood, through blood, through pain, through the weight of everything he'd lost. He fired. Maddox dropped. The room held its breath. Then the rain softened. Maeve pulled Rowan from the floorboards, cradled him. His crying eased. "You all right?" she asked Silas. "Hell no," he said, breathing ragged. "But we're alive. That'll do." She looked at him, really looked. They weren't fugitives anymore. They were something new. Not yet a family, but maybe the beginning of one. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas nodded. "Ain't over yet." "No," she said, "but it started." It was the first morning in weeks without thunder. The storm had passed, not with a bang, but a hush, like the sky had finally run out of tears. Mist curled over the hills. Trees stood heavy and watchful. Inside the cabin, Maeve knelt at the hearth, coaxing flame from damp kindling. Her fingers were cracked raw but steady. Rowan slept in the cradle, breath soft and even, a living proof that not all things break when the world does. Silas stirred on the cot. Pain flared in his side, but he welcomed it, a reminder he was still here. He watched Maeve without speaking, her silhouette framed in firelight, her strength in motion, not words. She looked peaceful, for the first time. "I thought we'd die that night," she said quietly. "We almost did, but we didn't." "No," Silas said, "we didn't." She handed him a tin of herbal tea, from a pouch he hadn't opened in years. "You ever kill a man before?" Silas took a long breath. "Only in defense, never made me proud. Never helped me sleep better." She nodded. "Same." They cleaned the blood, swept the shells, patched the windows. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The work was quiet, like a ritual rebuilding not just the cabin, but themselves. Near noon, a rider approached. Sheriff Danner. He dismounted slow, hand on his belt, eyes scanning for bodies. Silas stepped onto the porch, rifle resting like a crutch. "I heard Maddox got what was coming to him." "He got what he tried to give," Silas said. "Folks heard the shots, saw the smoke." "I ain't here to stir it up," the sheriff added. "Just want the story straight." Silas gave it, the short version. The truth without the scars. Some of his men might come sniffing, the sheriff said. But without him, most will vanish. He looked toward the door. The woman, she got a name. Silas didn't answer. The sheriff didn't push. If you need supplies, tell Marla, quietly. No one's looking to raise ghosts. He tipped his hat and rode off. The dust settled. Inside, Maeve had packed a small bag. Silas noticed. You going somewhere? I was. She tightened the strap. Thought I should keep running. He didn't stop her. He just waited. But maybe she set eyes on Rowan. He deserves to stay still. Maybe I do too. You're welcome here, Silas said. Not as your guest. What then? Sir Rowan in a whirlwind sheer banana. She held Rowan close, turned toward the window. The sun burned gently through mist. I don't need a name. Don't need a promise, just somewhere to belong. Silas stood beside her. You already do. No kiss, no grand confession. Just presence, stillness. Something real growing from what had been ruined. That night after Rowan slept, they sat on the porch close but not touching. The wind in the grass, the frogs calling. You think he'll remember, she asked. Not the way we will, Silas said. But maybe he'll feel it. What it means to be chosen, even when no one had to. She looked at the stars. When I was with Maddox, I used to dream of this. Not safety, just peace. A porch. A breath I didn't have to hold. Silas smiled faintly. It's a fine dream. It's real now. He nodded. It is. And the rain never came back. Some said the clouds had seen enough. Others said they'd emptied all they had that night. Or maybe the sky was waiting for two broken people and a child with quiet eyes to choose something better. As the fire burned low and the cabin held firm, the wind carried a whisper through the trees. Not all storms destroy. Some just wash away what needed to. Thank you for watching this journey. Sometimes the quietest choices make the loudest changes.